Welcome to Sounds of Brass.
All in a Day's Work, 30 Years as a Local Bobby, by Chris Helm.
Chapter 3. Don't walk on the footpath, it's safer to walk in the middle of the road. Walking from the bus station across the huge car park towards my new place of work, I stopped and stood for a few minutes, looking at Millgarth Street Police Station. It was a dirty red brick building, obviously needing a lick of paint, judging from the tatty window frames. To say it looked depressing was an understatement. It was built in 1878 as a divisional headquarters with a mortuary and a barracks, and cost £5,150. 6 years later, the building must have been in such a poor state of repair that the barracks were condemned by the medical health officer, and then, in 1903, the mortuary was transferred to Old Mill Lane in Hunslet. As I stood there, a voice from behind me said, "Are you going inside?" I noticed his white shirt. He must be a boss. "Yes, sir." "Well, you'd better hurry up if you're on the 2:10 shift." I followed him inside, and as I was looking around at my new surroundings, he disappeared up some stairs. Walking through the front door took me into a kind of lobby area, which was where the visiting public were dealt with by someone who I discovered was always referred to as the front office man. Through another set of doors there was a long counter stretching out on the right-hand side, like the kind you would see in the saloon of a cowboy film. There was also the distinct smell of old-fashioned floor polish on the lino-covered floor. I'm sure it was the same polish the cleaners used at our C of E school, if the distinct smell was anything to go by. "You're PC 862 Helm," a sergeant said. "We've been expecting you. I'm your shift sergeant." He took me to the locker room area. "This is yours. Put your stuff in here. Hurry up, you have to see the inspector. And don't salute him unless he is stood up and wearing his cap." Nervously standing outside the half-glass-panelled inspector's office, I was hoping he might give me a warmer welcome than the sergeant had. Once we were inside, there were no smiles, and not even a welcoming handshake. With his cigar in one hand and slouching back in his chair, the inspector introduced himself. "I'm your inspector, and you're on my shift. They tell me you're from Halifax. Where are you living?" "I'm in digs in Roundhay Road, sir." "Right, you can't live in Halifax when you work in Leeds. You're 2:10 tomorrow, don't be late." "No, sir," I said, and that was it. The sergeant escorted me out of the office and back into the corridor. He then showed me around the police station, and the more I saw, the more depressing it looked. I was taken into what he called the parade room, and told me I had to parade for duty 15 minutes before the start time. The purpose of this was to produce my handcuffs, staff, and other bits and pieces to the officer taking the parade. Everybody would then be given their duties for that shift along with any information they needed, including anything that had been reported by the preceding shift. "Go up to the canteen and get yourself a drink of tea. I will make arrangements for you to be shown around one beat by one of our experienced officers." The sergeant sounded quite human now, but it was to be short-lived, as I would discover later. Returning from the canteen, I was introduced to PC Arthur Gray, who the sergeant described as an experienced officer. He had over 20 years of service at Millgarth. His regular beat was an area known as Quarry Hill Flats, and he was to show me how to walk it. I signed the radio sheets and was issued with a blue Pi radio set, one piece for receiving, which clipped onto the collar of my uniform jacket, and the transmitter, which I kept in my pocket. Arthur was a round-faced chap with a uniform that barely seemed to fit him, and there were more horizontal creases in his trousers than any others. Walking into Quarry Hill Flats seemed a bit daunting, with the grey, towering blocks of flats that seemed to encircle you the further you went in. I noticed from almost that moment we arrived that we were being stared at through twitching curtains. "I'll tell you now, there are some right villains that live here," said Arthur, "but don't make the mistake of thinking that everybody is, because they're not. Some smashing people live here as well. Remember, treat everyone the same and you'll win their respect. Follow that throughout your policing career and you'll not go far wrong. I was brought up on a council estate, Arthur, I said, and I know what you mean. It's the same back home. Hey, get off the pavement, said Arthur. You never walk on the pavement in Quarry Hill. You always walk in the middle of the road, and I mean the middle. I was puzzled by this, and the expression on my face obviously told him so. Look, he said. You see up there? The flats were several stories high. You could see yourself being bombarded with flour bags, or even worse, the contents of someone's Saturday night bladder being sprayed over you from a great height. He went on to explain that in the past it had been known for the odd TV to be chucked off the roof at officers passing underneath, and with the TV travelling at 32 feet per second squared, you didn't get much time to duck. What have I come to? I thought. At its worst, Stony Lane Estate was never like this. The time passed very quickly, and at 9:30 p.m. we made our way back to the station. By 10 p.m. I was on my way back to my digs at Roundhay Road. I got to know Arthur quite well over the next few months, and I felt I could turn to him if I was stuck. He had given me some good advice about walking a beat, and some advice about who to look out for amongst the bosses. Once I was patrolling the city centre beats on my own, the inspector would regularly visit me for a chalk. This was when he inspected and signed my pocketbook, probably because I was new. One of the most irritating aspects about the inspector was that when it was raining he would sit in the passenger seat of his car and wind the window down a couple of inches, and the car heater on full blast. This allowed me just enough room to slide my pocketbook through the gap without the inspector getting cold or wet, but it left me standing in the pouring rain. Every time he came to see me it was always the same. How many PRs have you got this month? This meant persons reported, or in other words, how many you had reported for offences or locked up. Despite the fact that I was now 20 years old, I still found it difficult reporting or reprimanding people who were old enough to be my parents, or even grandparents. However, the inspector left me in no doubt that a dozen or so PRs a month and a few parking tickets dished out to vehicles on the unnamed road at the Merrion Centre would simply not be enough for him. Asking a lady her age is not an easy task when you are a young, fresh-faced and green 21-year-old, and she may be 40, 50, or even older. However, I developed a way to determine their age, which thankfully never failed. After getting the lady's name, I would say, "Can I have your age and date of birth, please?" Of course, some ladies would refuse and give the impression of being quite put out. "OK, let me say you are 64, I would say. "Young man, I'm not 64, I'm only 52. That'll do, 52. After a couple of weeks, I got a message to ring a sergeant who was looking for me. No reason was given. It transpired that he was the Force Band Sergeant, and he had heard about me being a bandsman. Now, I knew the Force had a military-style band, but I was brought up in brass bands. As an E-flat bass tuba player, this meant a significant change to me. I had to play music in bass clef rather than treble clef, as all brass band bass players do. He invited me to the band's next rehearsal. I went, and it was the best thing I did. I was now amongst people of a kindred spirit. We were all musicians, and being in a strange city, these were the only friends I really had. Many of the band were older, ex-military, and not from brass band backgrounds, but they were a great set of blokes, and many of them being really good players. The only real instruction the sergeant gave me as a new member was to be always on time. He told me that the rehearsals were 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. every Monday and Thursday. Duty time or your own time, you do not miss. After the band rehearsal, it was customary to adjourn to the Town Hall Tavern at the Westgate end of the Hedgerow. Amongst the band members, this drinking establishment was simply known as the THT. What a dive this was! Thinking back now, I don't suppose sawdust and spittoons would have been out of place, but it was a very popular place. It even had a mynah bird in a huge cage which had been taught to swear, and it knew all the words. No sooner had you walked through the door than you were greeted with the ear-piercing sound of an expletive. What a place! Whilst I have never been a big drinker, this band could drink anyone or anything under the table. But no one ever got drunk, missed a morning parade, or even did anything the least bit embarrassing after consuming so much beer. I am sure from the amount they consumed that every one of them must have had hollow legs. One of the lads bought me a drink. "Whatever you do," he said, "don't leave your drink to go to the gents." "Why?" I asked. "Just take my advice, don't." After about half an hour, Les, one of the euphonium players, got up to leave. However, before he left his full pint glass of beer, he looked at everyone and promptly took out his false teeth, putting them in the glass. "Now you won't drink my beer," he said. No one did drink his beer, but 6 of the lads promptly removed their false teeth and put them into Les's beer glass as well. You can imagine the laughter when Les returned, and of course, being an old bandsman, he was undeterred by the sight of a few sets of false teeth. He drank his beer all in one go. The licensee always blamed Les for the mynah bird's bad language. This was something I have often thought about over the years. Just how did she arrive at that conclusion? The answer turned out to be quite simple, because Les was the only customer who spoke with a Cockney accent. A mynah bird can reproduce and imitate sounds when in captivity, and Les was often seen talking to it. The licensee was convinced that the bad language used by her bird had a Cockney-sounding accent. As far as she was concerned, Les was the one who had been training it to swear. The streets of Leeds in 1970 were far different places to how they are today. While it was not quite the 24-hour city it is now, in those days there were still more people on the streets at 10 p.m. on a Wednesday than there were on Saturday afternoons back in Brighouse. The city was going through huge changes in the early 70s, and as a police officer who worked there every day, I was used to seeing and experiencing the changes firsthand. The pedestrianisation of what is now called the Bond Street Mall was in its infancy in 1970, and Millgarth constables had to carry out Bond Street patrols, advising motorists that this was now a no-go area for motor vehicles. It was these patrols that gave me time to talk to people, shoppers and shopkeepers alike. This was my style of working, building up people's skills and perhaps preventing crime, rather than the crash-bang-wallop style of policing on an evening or night shift. That style of policing was almost competitive, based on how fast the J4 van was filled up with prisoners and then transported to the Bridewell at the town hall. During the day, the city centre was a hive of activity, but working nights and particularly early mornings were often lonely and boring. However, there was one occasion when I had a rare, very early morning arrest that caused quite a stir. I was patrolling the outdoor market stalls area, clock-watching, I suppose, wishing the time away so that I could get the shift over with and go home. Looking around the empty stalls, I suddenly saw a pair of legs sticking out from underneath one. Male or female, alive or dead, I had no idea. But whoever it was, as I got closer to take a look, their smell became more and more nauseating. Crouching down to look at the body, the smell almost took my breath away, causing me to fall backwards. The body suddenly stirred. I was up on my feet straight away, shining my torch at the figure and discovering it was a male, best described as a tramp. "What you doing?" I said in a firm, controlling type of voice. In a half-wakened moan, he replied, "Trying to sleep." Once I had ascertained his details, a quick name-check revealed there was an outstanding warrant for him for a non-payment of £2 10 shillings. Great, I thought. Another PR to keep the inspector happy. This was one occasion when I looked forward to the arrival of the J4. Control to 862, we'll send a van round for you and your prisoner. Received. As soon as the van arrived with the sergeant in the front passenger seat, he went ballistic. Putting the prisoner into such a confined space, the smell in the J4 van was so bad that the sergeant and two other constables refused to travel in it, preferring to walk back to the station. This just left the prisoner, the driver, and I to go to the Bridewell. Thankfully, the streets were almost deserted as the driver took the J4 almost on two wheels off the hedgerow and into the Bridewell. Get out and take him with you. Don't close the back doors. I'll have to fumigate the van now, said the driver. As soon as we were out of the van, he drove away so fast that he must have burnt a coating of rubber off the tyres. This was the first time I had visited the Bridewell on my own. I presented the prisoner at the counter, and the duty sergeant started shouting at me straight away. "What have you brought him in here for?" I tried to explain about the warrant, but he didn't really want to know. "Have you any idea why this counter is so wide?" he asked. No, Sergeant." "Well, it's to stop the things he's got from jumping across onto me." It must have been the expression on my face. "Fleas, lad," he explained. "You'll start to feel them any minute now." He was right. No sooner had he said that, and I was itching from head to foot. "You'll have to take him to the disinfestation centre at Stanley Road, up in the Hare Hills, before you take him to court in the morning. Be back here for 9. I was back at the Bridewell by 8:30 a.m., and as the night shift had gone, I was now face to face with the early-turn sergeant and his staff. "So," he said, "it's you who is responsible for the stink in here." The sergeant was not pleased, and as hard as I tried to explain, he was obviously not going to listen to my protestations. "Right, get off to Stanley Road. The civvy driver will take you, and then, when your prisoner has been cleaned up, get him to court, and don't be late. They're going to love you down at courtroom 9. I was handcuffed to the prisoner, and I escorted him outside the van. The civvy driver opened the back doors, and we got in. The smell was horrendous. It seemed even worse than it had been when I first locked him up. My first impressions of the disinfestation centre were that it looked just as depressing as Millgarth had done on my first day. The centre staff took the prisoner away, which gave me chance to look around and ask about this awful place. For generations this was the place where people with head and body lice, crab lice, scabies and other parasitic things came to be given a clean sweep. It was also here where families brought their furniture to be debugged. 30 minutes later, and the prisoner was back. Putting the handcuffs back on, I almost choked with the smell. It's not the same smell as before. This time it was even worse, and is best described as a very rich, sickly, sweet smell. This smell was attributed to a concoction of catch-all detergents, which included Lifebuoy carbolic soap. Thankfully, the days when schoolchildren who were in trouble for swearing had their mouths washed out with carbolic soap were long gone. Then there was benzyl benzoate, which got rid of the mite linked to scabies, and finally DDT powder, which was used to get rid of crab lice and head and body lice. I suppose this combination was designed to kill all known germs, bugs and fleas, and other creepy crawlies he had. Well, 99% of them. In the back of the van, with both of us still handcuffed together, the smell was so strong that it made my eyes water and gave me a sickly taste at the back of my throat. Arriving at the town hall, we were being stared at, with the smell much stronger inside the building than out. We were in courtroom 9, which was historically where all the drunks and non-payment warrants were dealt with. After opening the doors, the usher looked at us. "What's that smell?" she asked. "Wait here." She went to the front of the court and spoke to the magistrate's clerk, who in turn spoke to the magistrates. "Clear the court," someone shouted. People moved so fast you'd have thought the place was on fire. The usher beckoned me to the front of the court, still handcuffed to the prisoner. The magistrates began by reprimanding me, telling me to never bring someone into the court again without them having been cleaned up first. "But he has, your worships," I said. "I've just brought him to the court from the disinfestation centre." "Never mind, officer, let's get on with it." The case was over in record time, 10 minutes at the outside. "1 week to pay," said the magistrates. "Now get him out." That was it. My first case at court was over and done with. I walked through that market area many times after that experience, but I never saw the prisoner again. On the plus side, I did manage to get a new uniform out of it. The smell clung to my clothes for days. That was over 40 years ago, and even now I can still remember the vile smell both before he was cleaned up and afterwards.